So, here we are. The final sermon from the book of Job. And if you're here for the first time this morning, that was inevitable. Job chapter 42. This morning we will be looking at verses 10 to 17, the final 8 verses of this book. This is, as I said, the final sermon of this book. It's also the 31st sermon that I have preached through it, as compared to 159 by Calvin, so say thank you. We began this, you remember, at the end of May last year, so it's been just a bit over 6 months, 7 months or so as we've been through this book. Now, let me just go ahead and dispense with the obvious question that will come to your mind somewhere along the way here. What are you going to do next? I will answer that tonight. So I will see you tonight, right? Now, I will say that by far this has been the most difficult sermon series I've ever preached. This is not an easy book. It is extraordinarily pedantic. It has more words in it than it needs, and it's difficult to get through. But even though I think I can say with some honesty that this has been the most inspirational book that I've ever preached. When I first chose this book, I really wasn't sure what I was getting into, to be honest with you. I really had no idea of what it was going to be. But it's been a tremendous book to consider, and it has helped me considerably, especially as I consider how Calvin himself looked at this book, particularly how the entirety of this book eventually funnels down to that phrase in chapter 42, verse 2, when Job confesses, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. That is, I think that's probably been more life-changing to me than any verse that I've ever preached before. And I hope that it's been helpful and edifying to you as well. I hope that this has been a book that has challenged you and really been helpful to you, that this confession that Job gives at the end has not only been enlightening, but I hope more than anything it's been assuring to you. Assuring to you. That this hasn't just been a book of information, but it has been a book that has helped you to go, oh, I understand now even more who this God is and what he is doing. And that gives me great assurance. So here we are. Let me summarize for you then how I perceive the book of Job. This book is a book about a man named Job who was a righteous man. And he was a righteous man by the express declaration of God. He was not righteous on his own. He was righteous because God declared him to be so. And he is afflicted by God, through Satan, but by God, to demonstrate an eternal purpose. If I could write one sentence about the book of Job, paste it at the front of the book, that would be it. This is a man who is righteous by God's declaration, and God afflicts him to demonstrate an eternal purpose. Now, I realize that Job didn't initially get it. He didn't initially understand it. He missed the point of it. But he comes to realize over the course of the book that the sovereign God is free of his own nature as God, according to his own holy, eternal decree to do with us as he pleases. He's free to do with this world and with individual men as he pleases. And we must respond rightly to that truth. We must respond rightly to the truth. The right response to the idea that God is sovereign is a deep sense of assurance. God is God. God is God. And he's free to do what he wills, which means that he is always doing what is good and right in his eyes and according to his own purposes. For he has purposed all that comes to pass. And he hasn't just purposed it in order to experiment with humans. He has purposed it in order to glorify himself. There's an audience that is watching. That audience is angelic and human. And he is doing what he is doing to glorify himself. Again, the doctrine of the sovereignty of God is not some sort of theoretical idea that Reformed people throw around to say how cool we are. No, it's a doctrine of immense personal value. It's foundational to the very existence of life. If you wander around this world with no sovereign God, you have no hope at all. You have nothing to hang on to. You have no anchor. But Job came to recognize through what God had done that he was under the purpose and plan of God. And he found great assurance in it. So verses 10 to 17 are the epilogue of this book. It's a logical bookend to what we saw in chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. At the beginning of the book, we learn about what Job was by God's hand, and now we see him being restored to what he was. In chapter 1 to 5, in the prologue of the book, it shows us who Job was prior to Satan's attack, and 42, 10 to 17 will show us who Job is after. So in the prologue, we see who he was before. In the epilogue, we see who he is after. A righteous man before, a righteous man after. A blessed man before, a blessed man after, and so on. Which means that for some 29 sermons or so, we were just looking at an interlude in Job's life. That's it. Just a minor speed bump along the way in the man's life. I mean, that's a bizarre way to summarize an entire sermon series, isn't it? The last 30 weeks of your life have been just a speed bump in the life of Job. Hopefully not in yours, but in his. God now comes and restores what was lost out of his eternal purpose and decree over Job's life. So I'm going to suggest to you this morning as we look at this epilogue that God is going to restore three things to Job's life. First, he's going to restore his reputation. Secondly, he's going to restore his fortune. And thirdly, he's going to restore his family. Now, you can make all the arguments you want about which of those is most important of the three. You might argue that it's going in increasing level of importance. I'm not going to attempt to make that point, but I'm going to say this. It's all out of God's mercy and grace. So we'll start with God restoring Job's reputation. Verse 10, "And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before." Now, let me just pause there, as this verse is somewhat of an introduction to the prologue, is what it is. It's sort of like, okay, stop, all of that is over, now let's move in a different direction. The text reads, "The Lord restored the fortunes of Job and gave Job twice as much." Now, have you noticed, you probably already know this, but Job doesn't get twice as many children as he had from before. So the phrase "twice as much" here is mostly a reference to the reputation and wealth of Job. You could make a very good argument that the children that Job had second time around were doubly important, and I'll show you some evidences of that, but they're still the same number. So don't look at this as God doubled everything that Job had. It's more of a statement of God blessed Job tremendously. Call it double if you want, but the idea is this is a tremendous blessing that the Lord pours out upon him, okay? I would put it like this. We are not, as believers, looking forward to being what Adam was in the garden originally. That was great. But we are looking for much more than that. Okay? So that's the idea here. It's not designed to be count the number of sheep to see if it's twice as much. Now you will, of course, find it is. but the point is that it's a tremendous blessing. over and above, if you will. So it's a cup overflowing. And certainly not because Job deserved it, but rather to demonstrate that everything that has happened to Job is out of God's decree. All right, so verse 11 then. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted for all the evil or all the disaster that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. Now we're told that two different groups come to Job. One, his brothers and his sisters, and then secondly, all who had known him before. I do think there's a distinction there. The brothers and sisters and all who had known him before. Now the former, brothers and sisters, is probably here a reference to his literal siblings, okay? His family, if you will, his extended family. Now don't forget, Job lived in an agrarian society, in an agrarian culture, in an agrarian time frame in human history. Human survival was built around close family connections, both to one another and to the land. When you live in an agrarian world, as my wife and I were privileged to do in Kansas for 11 years, you see how that connection of family is so very important. It's so very important. Family rights of inheritances, for example, were singularly important. Notice the end of verse 15b, that their father, that is Job, gave them, that is his daughters, an inheritance among their brothers. There's a sense of this family relationship. Survival in that day depended upon the continuation of farming a plot of land that was kept in the family. You passed it down from generation to generation. Your sons took up the family business of farming because they were keeping their family alive. And as you, as a man, became too old to farm that land, you needed your children to continue to farm it so that you would survive. So there's a sense in which family is deeply important. For example, in the Levitical code, what we call the Law of Sinai, or the Mosaic Law, there were many such laws established by God within the civil pillar of the Mosaic Law. For example, redeeming land sold due to debt or catastrophe, the Jubilee, etc., all mentioned, for example, in Leviticus 25, are all laws designed to protect this continuation, this reality. So the visit by Job's brothers and sisters was probably to help Job overcome the great financial loss he had incurred when Satan destroyed virtually everything he owned. Because he's sitting there on the ash heap and everything is gone. So it's an obvious visitation by family, recognizing Job's great need. So they come. His brothers and sisters come to him. Out of their pity for him, they come. But we also learn that there are those who were known to him before, all who had known him before. And this is undoubtedly a reference to those with whom he had had financial dealings in the past. Neighbors, non-family members around his area that were connected to him financially. They were people who respected him because of his wealth. And he even himself, you remember, mentions this in his speech. You go back to chapter 29, verses 21 to 25. He speaks about how, he would speak and men would listen to him. He would provide help for those that had need. Remember, he was whining about the fact that God wasn't taking care of him because he had been doing these things in the past. But he's right. He had an influence by virtue of his wealth. In fact, the very beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 2, we are told by the writer that Job was considered, quote, the greatest of all the people of the East, unquote. Remember that? He was a man who had a tremendous influence, and his influence was directly related to his material wealth. He possessed wealth, and that wealth produced influence, and he bragged about that influence even while he was whining about his relationship to God. So they come too. They come to him as well. But I would suggest that they come for a very different reason than family came. A very different reason. In my opinion, I believe that these neighbors came to see Job because they were compelled by the sovereign hand of God to do so. Now, you say, how do you know that? Okay, think about it for a second. What would have happened to Job's influence and reputation once Satan destroyed everything that he had? Would he now be a man of great influence? Would he now be a man who would speak and people would listen? Nope. His wealth evaporates, his influence evaporates. He's no longer the great rich man known as Job. Now, he certainly probably had friends outside who respected him for who he was, but make no mistake about it, in most parts of the world, in most cultures, there's a tangible connection between wealth and influence, which is why I have none. There's usually a tangible connection, right? We think of the wealthy, and they're the ones that get the news reports, and they're the ones that speak and people listen, right? So, by being sent to abject poverty by Satan's attack, Job no longer possesses the influence that such wealth would hold. Men would no longer see him as important or as an influence. And let me suggest to you that that's exactly what Satan wanted, okay? That's what he wanted. This man is a righteous man with influence. We can't have that anymore. The way to get rid of his influence is to get rid of his wealth. So to restore Job, God sends more than just his family to see him. He sends those who had known him before, those who knew his previous reputation as a man of influence. They wouldn't have come on their own, but they would come if God compelled them to come. In other words, I put it also like this. Job's righteousness in and of itself is not an influence just because he is a righteous man. It is an influence only because God permeates that into the lives of others. Our righteousness is not something we can look at and brag about. Our justification is not something we can say, look at me, and look down our noses on others who don't have that from the Lord. No, quite the opposite. We recognize that we are only just in the sight of God because God has declared it to be so. And therefore, any influence that we might have, even as a righteous man, is due to what God does through it, not what we do with it. And so God compels men who had known him to come to him. Now, just as an aside, do you think Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are amongst this number? They had known him before, right? Now, I would have you to remember that although Job was wealthy, his reputation was more than just his wealth. Okay? Let's be clear about that. The clear implication of chapter 1, verse 1, and even of 29, 21, and following, is that he used his wealth for good. So he's a righteous man in terms of his wealth because he uses his wealth as a righteous man. He takes what he has been given by God and he uses it well in the lives of others. That may be the compelling reason why they come to him. So this guy wasn't some stingy miser, Ebenezer Scrooge, that didn't use his wealth well, but Job did. And the result was that men were compelled to come to it. I think that would be how to explain how God got them there. He used all of his blessings to honor God by helping others. He was even he himself says he was a source of wisdom. I spoke, men listened to me. So let me just insert at this point here a quick observation by way of principle. The New Testament is clear, is it not? The New Testament is clear that wealth can be a source of great spiritual danger. Right? You know the whole camel through the eye of a needle thing, right? We know that wealth can be of great spiritual danger. The rich young ruler that came to Jesus and asked him what was necessary was told by Jesus, just go sell everything you have and come and follow me. And what did he do? He walked away sad. We know from the New Testament that great wealth can be a source of great spiritual danger. It becomes, for many who possess it, their idol. It becomes their God. But it is also true that God does grant wealth to some in order for him to glorify him with it. Some of you may be saying, gee, I wish the Lord would let me glorify him a little bit more. But again, it's the sovereign God we're dealing with, right? And so he does give to some great resources and great wealth. But what is he expecting those who know him, those who understand his sovereignty, to do with it? Glorify him. For those who have been made holy by the regenerating work of the Spirit of God, money is simply a means through which those blessed with it can glorify God through its unselfish use. Now listen. You may be thinking to yourself right about now, well, yeah, that applies to those wealthy people. I ain't one of them. But you are. I'll walk you through the streets of Mombasa, the territory that Barnabas preaches in, and you will be ashamed of what you have, even if you're deeply in debt here. We are wealthy beyond words in this place. So we must remember this. If we have been born again by the Spirit of the living God, if Christ has sent his Spirit to raise us from the dead, everything we have, even if we think we have little, is to glorify him. In the second half of verse 11, it says that they come to bring him a piece of money and a ring of gold. A piece of money would probably be anything that would pass for money in the second millennium BC world of Edom. Now, the idea of proxy, proxy wealth, paper dollars that represent wealth, doesn't really come into play until well into the second millennium AD. So in those days, 2,000 years or more before Christ, money would have been at that time probably simply the idea of valuable metals, valuable things that could be used as barter, the trading of valuable metals through time. Gold, silver, copper, bronze, all of these were considered precious, and so this is probably a reference to some quantity of one or more of these. You think of like a talent of silver, right? It's the idea of, okay, here is money. So it's not as though they handed them, $100, crisp $100 American bills. It doesn't exist at that time. They were giving, in that sense, various kinds of things that would have been considered valuable for barter purposes. Now, there were forms of money dating all the way back to ancient Egypt as proxy, but they're very limited. And it's probably where Job is living here in southern Canaan on the east side of the Dead Sea in Edom. It's highly unlikely that there would have been any sort of standardized money in that place. So when they came to bring him money, they came to bring him that which is valuable, something he could trade and use. But they also bring him a ring of gold. Now, isn't it interesting that the writer differentiates between they brought him money and they brought him a ring of gold? And I think what they brought him not only was some sort of measurement of silver or gold or whatever, but they also brought him a specific tangible asset representing, now get this, both wealth and status. Because that's what a ring of gold would represent. It represents something, a piece of jewelry with value, in this case probably made from gold, representing not only its inherent cash value, but also its status before others. It's interesting that jewelry often does this, doesn't it? I am wearing a wedding ring. It represents that I have a bond to a specific woman, and since I can't get it off, we're stuck together. So It's a piece of jewelry that represents something, right? The gold in it isn't all that valuable per se. I might get $50 for it if I went to a pawn shop. But its value is infinitely more than that because what it represents is infinitely more than that. That's what's going on here. It's a ring of gold, which is designed not just to be wealth, but to be a status symbol. Here is a ring of gold. It represents our respect for you as Job, the man, and we want to convey our respect for you with this piece of jewelry. So as I said at the outset, this is God restoring, firstly, the reputation of Job. Job has lost his reputation by virtue of now being a man of abject poverty. But God restores, firstly, his reputation. Although he had lost his status by virtue of Satan's attack, God now restores it through the generosity of his family and his friends and co-workers and neighbors and all others that he had influence over through time. Now, isn't that interesting that God starts here? Isn't that interesting that God starts here? And let me suggest to you that God starts here as a parallel to Job's spiritual restoration. His spiritual restoration. Just as Job had lost some of his reputation of being righteous by virtue of how he talked about God in all those speeches and at the end had to admit that he had been foolish and sinful, he had lost some of his reputation of being righteous. God restores that righteousness by leading Job to the place where he repents of his sin. You could say it's Job's first restoration. So at the beginning of the chapter, the very first restoration of Job is his spiritual righteousness. He's been returned to being that man who God considers to be righteous. And he bows down and confesses, repents. But the same is going on here. God restores his material reputation. And he does it, I think, as a reflection of his spiritual reformation. Why does God give him back his material reputation, his influence in the world? Because God has already given him back his spiritual reputation. Given him back his relationship to himself. So, God restores Job's reputation to twice as much as he had before. That doesn't say that in the text, but I'm going to assert it based on what it says at the beginning, the prologue to the epilogue, right? In verse 10. God restored the fortunes of Job and gave Job twice as much as he had before. What does he have? He has twice the reputation now. He was certainly a man of great influence before, but the implication here is that Job is now twice the man in the eyes of others. He's twice the man. So first, God restores his reputation. But now, God comes and restores his fortune. Verse 12. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. The statement in verse 10 is literally counted as true here. Literally. The number of sheep, camels, oxen, and female donkeys is exactly double what it was in 1:3. Just go back and look. It's exactly double in each case. So God intended to double the fortune of Job by restoring to him twice what he had before. One observation, however, that I would point out here is that although verse 1:3 mentions that Job had very many servants, along with all of those sheep and oxen and donkeys and so forth, there is no mention of servants here. But it's clearly implied they're there, isn't it? I mean, how in the world is a man by himself going to take care of 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, that's 2,000 actual head of oxen, because a yoke is 2 of them, and 1,000 female donkeys? My guess is, if I'm also going to extend this text through a little sanctified speculation, that it's probable that God also increased all the other things that Job had before that are not mentioned or listed here, like male donkeys, right? So, even though servants are not mentioned, in my humble opinion, the servants needed to tend all these animals would also need to increase doubly. Thus, there is an assumption here that the reader would automatically recognize. It doesn't have to be explicitly stated, right? It doesn't have to the writer doesn't have to explicitly state, oh yeah, and God gave me back all these servants that I needed to manage this. In fact, there's an implication even later in this chapter. We're not told, are we, that the children that Job has come from the same woman he had before. But we imply it, right? We imply it. Now, again, let me remind you that numbers of livestock would be an indication of relative wealth in an agrarian society, okay? Relative wealth in an agrarian society would be based on the number of animals you have. By giving Job twice as many as he had before, God is sending a clear statement, making a clear statement. This man, Job, is under my decrees and purposes. This is God speaking. Job is under my decrees and purposes, a man of great wealth. He's being reestablished as a wealthy man in order that his life might be clearly understood to be under the direction of God himself. How else do you explain a doubling? How else do you explain a doubling? Other than, got to be divine intervention. I mean, I could see it easily that Job could restore what he had before in the sense of having the same number as he had before to become what he was before, right? In the sense of having 3,000 sheep instead of 6,000 sheep, right? Or 7,000 sheep instead of 14,000 sheep. He could easily have gone back to what he was before. But the point of doubling it is for God to say, this is what I am purposing. This is what I am doing. So your attention, isn't it, when you look at that passage, your attention is, that's got to be God's work. It's not Job's work. It's got to be God's work to accomplish that. So let me ask you a question. How exactly did Job come to possess so many animals? How did the process play itself out? Did they just helicopter in from the sky? Did a big old transport fly over and parachute them out into Job's land? Now, of course, that's preposterous, right? They didn't have those kind of airplanes in those days. And the answer is that Job accumulated them over time, using the monetary wealth he had received as gifts from those who had come to him above. They gave him money and they gave him a ring, and he used that to bring himself back to a place of great wealth. See it? Now, I want you to hold that thought. Job accumulated them as God directed, the ordinary means of Job going back to his regular life and using what was given to him well. He used it well. So, God restores Job's fortune to twice as much as he had before. While he was a man of great wealth before, the implication here is that Job is now twice the man he was in the eyes of the world. So far we've seen that God doubles his reputation and God doubles his fortune as a result of it. But now we come to the third thing that God restores, and that is that God restores Job's family. Verse 13. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he called the name of the first daughter Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapuk. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. Now, as I said before, it should be obvious that it is the wife of Job, the same one who told him to curse God and die. It is that particular woman who becomes the mother of these children. There's no hint in this book ever, anywhere, that Job divorced his wife after her insolence and married another and thus had a bunch more kids, or that he had multiple wives, which was, you remember, a common reality in early human history from which these children came. Remember, if Job is a contemporary of Abraham or around the same time, remember that Abraham himself had no problem accepting Sarah's invitation to have a child with Hagar. Remember that? Polygamy was not an unknown reality in that time, but there's no hint in this book that Job ever had another wife. So what does that mean? It means that as a side effect of God restoring Job, God also restored Job's wife. In his mercy, he restores her too. You know, we kind of forget about the fact that, you know, when Job went down, she went down. When those original 10 sons and daughters were killed, they were her children too. How was she feeling about that? How was she thinking about that? She suffered the loss of the fortune as well, right? She was immediately sent to abject poverty. And I could extend that even one step further. She comes to her husband who's sitting there with some sort of grave skin disease and wonders if he's going to die, which is a very real possibility in that particular day and age. What would have happened to her if he would have died? She had had nothing. Her offspring are gone. Her wealth is gone, or Job's wealth that would have been hers is gone. Where would she have gone? Where would she have been? Which is why I find it so very ironic that she told him to curse God and die. That's the worst advice she could have possibly given him. But in his mercy, God restores her too. The righteousness of Job extends around and envelops his wife. Extends around and envelops his wife. Which is a lesson for us as husbands, guys. Remember, it's our responsibility as men to lead our households in righteousness, which means that your righteousness needs to extend and envelop your wife. She will stand before God and be judged on the basis of her righteousness, and she must come by faith to Christ. But if we are Christian men and we have Christian wives, we have a responsibility to wrap our righteousness around her and lead her forward in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, just like we would with our children. Job did that. I'm convinced, again, sanctified speculation here, but I'm convinced that Job, being restored by God, grants through him a restoration of her. So, as before, although Job doubled his reputation and his wealth, the doubling of his family is not in the numerical sense, as I mentioned before. He's restored only again with 7 sons and 3 daughters, not 14, 7. Yet, it's interesting, isn't it, that the author goes out of his way to note the uniqueness of these particular children as compared to the first, right? If Job is writing this down, which I think he is, then Job goes to doing a little bragging here. Okay? He goes to doing a little bragging here. Now, let's not forget that girls were not considered to be of special value materially in ancient agrarian societies. Doesn't mean they were unimportant. Fathers loved their daughters and recognized that their daughters were going to become new families in that society. So fathers loved their daughters, but they were not at the center of inheritance rights and so forth. They were not treated as central in terms of passing on things like land, inheritance rights, family names, wealth transfer, all those sorts of things. I would say as God himself intended, okay? Yet the writer describes the daughters as more beautiful than all other women. More beautiful. In all the land, there were no women as beautiful as Job. So in all of Edom, there were no girls more beautiful than these 3. In fact, their names are descriptive of this great beauty. Their names are descriptive of this great beauty. Jemima is a word in Hebrew meaning dove. Kezia is a kind of perfume, or some suggested a fragrance. And Keren Happuch is a type of eye shadowing. So the three of them together are, these girls are as beautiful as the most well made up women in the world. Not that they were beautiful by virtue of makeup, but they were beautiful in that, how do you describe them, sort of sense. Now, I would just pose a quick question here. Do you think Job's sons were handsome? I mean, the daughters are beautiful. Could the sons be handsome too? It seems like that's a very real possibility, right? But again, Job goes to a little bragging here. I've got daughters. And it also says that Job gives his daughters an inheritance among their brothers. See it at the end of verse 15? I read it before. You know, normally you don't do that. In agrarian society, you don't pass down land through your daughters because that land moves out of your family. Once the daughter marries another man, she takes on the name of that man. She becomes a part of his family. And so the land that would be now part of your family transfers to them. And you don't want to do a lot of that because what do you wind up with? Nothing. You give it all away through your daughters to others. So it wasn't typically done that way. It was passed down from son to son. But Job gives them an inheritance. And he pictures them by doing so as equal to their brothers. Not only by the inheritance that he gives to them, but by the beauty that God has bestowed on him. So I think the way to understand the whole God gave Job, twice as much as he had before, in this particular case, is that these children are doubly special to Job. While he certainly loved the first 7, you remember, we'd learn at the prologue of the book that he would even go and make sacrifice for them in the event that they would curse the name of the Lord at some point along the way during their parties. He would offer sacrifice for them. He certainly loved them. But there seems to be here in writing the way that this is written, that these are far more special to me. You lose something, and when it's restored, you appreciate it more, don't you? Deb and I have a phrase in our house which came into play this past week, and the phrase goes something like this: how can I miss you if you won't go away? She says that to me all the time. How can I miss you if you won't go away? But think about the underlying feeling. It's, I appreciate you. I will appreciate you even more when you come back. Things that are restored to us become even more special to us. So I imagine that Job's reputation in the community, as he had this great wealth and the kind of influence that he would now have with people around him, was even more precious than what he had before. So he would use it even better. He would use it even better. And the same is true with his fortune. He would use those monies now to glorify God even more. And with these children, he would love them even more as they represented what God was doing in and around and through him. So, God restores his reputation, God restores his fortune, and God restores his family. He's now twice the man that he was in the eyes of his family. Twice of what he was in the eyes of the world, and now twice as much as what he was in the eyes of his family. But there are 2 additional verses at the end that we must not overlook. And let me suggest a 4th thing that God restores, and that is that God restores Job's life. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations, and Job died an old man full of days. Now, whatever skin disease Job had was not fatal. Okay? Obviously, he recovered from it, maybe supernaturally, or maybe just through the natural process of healing over time. Doesn't say, right? But he lived. And he lived, it says, an additional 140 years. Okay, see how that's written? And after this, Job lived 140 years. So he was old enough, he lived long enough to see his great grandchildren of these latter sons and daughters. So of the 10 that were given to him after this, that I mentioned before, being very beautiful, he lived long enough to see their great-grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, through them. I would note, by the way, that this longevity is another evidence that these events occurred around the time of Abraham. How long did Abraham live? According to Genesis 25:7, he lived to be 175 years old. So it makes sense, doesn't it, that Job, living in that same day and age, would live to this grand age. We don't know how old he was when he was afflicted. Let's assume that he was a fairly young man at that point, but he lives an additional 140 years. We don't know how old he was when he dies. Verse 17 doesn't tell us. And let me suggest to you that the reason why these grand ages are here in this early section of human history is because the after effects of the flood have not yet taken effect. If you look at the ages of men prior to the flood, they're huge, aren't they? I mean, you look at Genesis chapter 5, look at the lengths of the ages there. You're talking average age being over 700. But then the age falls off dramatically. And God says it's going to. Remember, after the flood, he limits the age of men upon the earth. But let me suggest that the natural mechanism by which that would be occurs, that now that the canopy of water has fallen from the sky, UV rays are now much more prevalent, and therefore men will age faster, and age will go down from that point. It hasn't fully taken effect yet. So, let me pose the following question as we come to the end of this epilogue. How long did it take for all of the events of 42:11 to 15 take place? How long? How long did it take? How long did it take for Job's reputation, his fortune, and his family to be restored to him? How long? Our natural inclination is to read this text almost as though this occurred instantaneously, right? We have a tendency to think like that. Oh, God just gave him 6,000 sheep or 14,000 sheep, and God gave him 10 children. But that's not the case, is it? How long would it have taken for Job's wife to have 10 babies? Okay, ladies. Some of you as experts at this. How long would that have taken? 2 years? How long would it have taken for Job's wife to give birth to 10 separate children, and for those children to grow up to become very beautiful women? And the answer is probably somewhere around 40 years. 40 years. How long would it take it for Job to accumulate 14,000 sheep? Would that have happened overnight? Would he have been able to go down to the local stockyard and take those various bits of money that he had and buy 14,000 sheep and bring them home? That would have taken time, wouldn't it? It would have taken time. God did restore Job, but he didn't do it overnight. He didn't do it instantaneously. God used the ordinary means of collecting reputation and wealth, the ordinary means of bearing and raising children to get to the final result. And what's the point? There's one particular thing that most of us have a tendency not to connect the sovereignty of God unto. That was a poorly worded sentence, ended with a preposition. There's some things in this life, there's one thing in this life that we have a tendency to discount the sovereignty of God. And it's time. Time. How often do we find ourselves saying, Lord, heal me and do it now. Lord, I need you to take care of something. We'll talk tomorrow afternoon when you have it finished. But our God is not just sovereign over the things of this world. He is also sovereign over time. He is not only the governor of all the things that happen upon this world, but he is also sovereign over time, for he is not limited by it. He is not limited by the slow flow of time. Our God purposes that time is also a means of accomplishing what he wills. He's not bound by time because he exists outside of it. He created it as a part of this world. Time is a creation of God. Just as space is a creation of God, and just as physical light, meaning energy, is a creation of God, and matter is a creation of God, so is time. And our God exists outside of it. The interesting thing of the incarnation is that it is in the incarnation where God himself came to experience time. He came in time to a specific place and time, and he lived in time to experience time, as we do. God has purposed that time is also a means of accomplishing what he wills. See, we expect God to move according to our timetables. Given how little time we possess in this life, we often need, quote unquote, for God to move at our pace. Right? We need God to move at our pace. Look, I only got 70, according to Scripture. Speed it up. We do this all the time. We do it in a lot of, that's a pun. We do it because we are bound by time. Let me give you an example. This is becoming much more and more of a thought of mine based on a conference I'm going to be going to in March. Where exactly is it written that the church age is 2,000 years in length? Where's that written? Can you show me the passage of Scripture where it says that the church age will last 2,000 years? What if the church age is 6,000 years? Instead of being the period of time from Christ back to Abraham, what if it's synonymous with the period of time of Christ back to Adam? We've spent the last century, the 20th century, hoping that God will come back in this time because we need him to come back, right? Because things look desperate. But what if God is sitting and going, yeah, they look desperate from your perspective, but not from mine. Because in my eyes, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So you know what? The church age so far has only been a couple of days. I got time. But our problem, right, is we're trapped in history. We're trapped in this world of time, and we have limited time. And because we live our lives in such a way that we also waste so much of it, that we need for God to move, and quickly. Come on. But here's the point. As is the point through the entirety of this book, men must respond rightly to the sovereignty of God. We must respond rightly. If we've come to understand that God is free to do as he wills, and he's free to do it however long he wants to, so be it. We respond by being grateful to him. We must respond rightly to the fact that God has purposed all that comes to pass, including the passage of time, for His glory. God is doing a work in His own, and it is a long-term work, not a short-term work. The Spirit of God, when He opens our hearts, brings us to Christ, He's not in the business then of impatience. Nope. He looks at you and says, I got the rest of your life to do this. However long that might be. And I might decide, this is the Spirit speaking now, I might decide, you know what? I know that guy's elect, but I'm not going to save him until he's 78 years old. It takes God 40 years to restore to Job what was taken away from him in an instant. See it? At the beginning, Satan took it away instantaneously. In the hope that Job would go, okay, just curse God and die. But God gives him back over time what he lost. So God uses even time itself to glorify Himself. And the heavenly audience watched the whole time.